Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Citizen Engagement and Deliberative Democracy Festival, organized by the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. My name is Ramses Grande, and I'm delighted to be your moderator today during our special session on citizen engagement strategies, putting cohesion policy and participation into practice. Before we start, I would like to give you a brief overview of our session. We will have a 90-minute interactive debate focused on two topics. First, we will discuss which challenges are faced by managing authorities to put participation in cohesion policy into practice, and we will discuss which strategies can be used to address them. Second, we will dive deeper into the competences and the resources needed by managing authorities and civil society to promote meaningful engagement. We will be joined on stage today by three expert panelists: Claudia Chwalisz from the OECD, Sandor Lederer from K-Monitor, and Francesco Amodeo from DG REGIO. And to make this debate more interactive, we also have the reactions from two guest speakers, Patrick Lavelle and Karolis Granickas. Of course, we also count on your participation. When we launch a poll in a minute, we want to know who is in the room and what your experience with participation has been so far. And we also have a dedicated Q&A box where you can post any questions you may have to the speakers at any time, and our colleagues will harvest them for our Q&A sessions. We will have two of them. Also, should you have any technical issues, please also raise your comments in the Q&A. I'd like to briefly introduce the rest of our host team, including the technical assistants that is in charge for running the video call, Jan Mael, Mateus, and Ana Paola. And without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Mr. Stefan Appel, who is the head of unit for administrative capacity building at REGIO, to put today's debate about citizen participation in the context of REGIO's work on promoting good governance. Mr. Appel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ramses, and good morning from me to everybody here. Very happy to see so many interested in this event. And we come from DG REGIO, so the part dealing with regional development funds, cohesion funding. And this unit is responsible for administrative capacity building in a wider sense. So we try to help member states to improve their capacity to implement our funds. So we have a mandate and a very strong commitment to improve the overall governance in the management of our funds and to help member states to improve their capacities. And it has become, let's say, an increasingly acknowledged horizontal challenge to have a more open, transparent, and inclusive way to manage cohesion programs in order to improve the results, to be effective and efficient. So what does open governance mean? It means that governments are open to feedback and ideas from other stakeholders. And this also includes increasingly civil society organizations and citizens. We have the so-called partnership principle in cohesion policy already for some time. It has developed, but I think the element of including civil society organizations and citizens is in our funding and regional funding still something which can be improved further. That's why we try to find new ways and give new inspirations for our managing authorities to do so. In the context of cohesion policy, we also have in the next programming period a new policy objective called Bringing Europe Closer to Citizens. And that targets to engage citizens in the management process around AC funds. And when I say in the management, I mean we aim to have better citizen engagement across the whole cycle, from design over implementation and monitoring to evaluation. And we see this as a very important way to improve also the transparency and the implementation outcomes. So when I say this is a particular policy objective, it is meant to be horizontal across all the programs under cohesion funding. And it should be applied where it makes sense. And I think it makes a lot of sense in many places. This workshop is part of our activities to develop knowledge and to disseminate what is available. It builds on a high-level conference we have organized in 6th of February this year. So it was probably one of the last events which took place in Brussels with physical presence. And I'm also very happy that this has not gone down in the history books as a super spreader event, but I think for the virus, but I hope it will be a super spreader event for better citizen engagement in cohesion policy. And this, I think, was a very big event, which also, through the presence of our Vice President Switzer, made clear that cohesion policy has a strong link, and citizen engagement in cohesion policy, a strong link to the future conference on the future of Europe. I think the Commission, across many policy areas, has identified citizen engagement as a very important part of our implementation to regain trust of our citizens, and also to make sure that cohesion policy is a policy not only for the people, but also with the people. At the conference, we had announced 2 follow-up initiatives, 2 pilot actions for managing authorities and civil society organizations, which are being implemented now. And you will hear through the speakers a bit more about this. In this workshop, we want to dive more into the how to develop participation strategies and the competences and resources needed by managing authorities to implement practices of deliberative democracy more efficiently and more effectively. So I encourage all participants to bring in their real-life examples. This will enrich discussions, and this will also make everybody understand better the goal of this workshop. And it will also help to inspire people through examples, ideas you might be having. So without further ado, I give back to Ramses. I wish you a very successful workshop, and I hope you will enjoy the discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Appel. Indeed, participation cannot be done individually, and we want to get the contribution from everyone who is in the room today. And that's why I would ask my colleague Mateusz to launch the brief poll right now. We've prepared 3 questions, and we just want to sense the heat in the room and hear in the first question which stakeholder group to belong to. You have 60 seconds time, and the poll should have been launched right now in front of you. So please indicate whether you come from government or regional representation, you belong to academia, if you're from civil society organization, or just simply an interested citizen, or whether you're a politician or from an EU institution. And I see that we already have the second and the third questions available, so you may as well go and answer the 3 questions at the same time at your own convenience. And in that second question, we are asking you to give us a brief account of how your experience with citizen participation has been so far, and whether you already have an example where you applied citizen engagement in cohesion policy. I will give you a little bit more time. And last but not least, what are the main challenges to include citizen participation in your day-to-day work? We acknowledge that participation can also be a challenging issue, and I hope that our speakers will address this during the debate. And perhaps you've encountered some of these issues in your own work, and we'd be really keen to hear about it, and hopefully also in the Q&A discussion that we'll be having later. How are we doing with time? I think we should give everyone a few more seconds to cast your votes. Also, in the first 2 questions, please add the single answer that most represents your opinion. But on the third one, you will have a multiple choice where you can indicate several. And of course, this is a non-exclusive, exhaustive list, which means hopefully if you have other ideas, you can write them in the Q&A and we can discuss them during our Q&A session. Okay, I think we should go on to disclose the results, if my colleague Mateusz agrees. And we can see now the results. I hope you can see them as well. We have quite a significant presence of civil society members today from NGOs, which is fantastic. And as well, we also have some people from governments, from regional representations, academia, citizens, and EU institutions. So quite a varied number of people in the room. And then I see very interesting results also for the second question, where the vast majority has not had a previous example of implementing participation in cohesion policy, but they see where the potential benefit could be. So I hope that today's discussion can motivate you even further to implement it in your day-to-day work. And also, I see that we have some experiences already with diverging results. So I hope we can hear from that. And then when we dive into the third and last question as to what are the main challenges to include citizen participation, we see that the lack of resources or funding is probably the most important answer, the most important issue. But there are also quite strong answers as to, I don't know how to do it. Hopefully we can answer that question today. And also the lack of institutional political support seems to be an important issue. So I'd like to thank all the participants who provided us with their feedback. And I hope the panelists can take up some of these thoughts in the debate. And let us now move over to the speakers. And I will start with a short introductory question about the current work on citizen participation. Claudia Chwalisz, let's start with you. At OECD's Open Government Unit, you co-led a recent study where you analyzed, I think, more than 280 practices of deliberative democracy across the OECD countries and over the last 30 years. And in the recent years, we saw an increase in the overall number of participatory initiatives and also across the different levels of government. And in the report title, you speak about catching this deliberative wave. So how mature are governments, particularly in the EU, in terms of political support, institutional competences, and resources for incorporating citizens in public policymaking?
Yes, thank you, Ramses, for this great introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here with everyone today. So as you mentioned, indeed, at the OECD in June of this year, we published a report called Innovative Citizen Participation in New Democratic Institutions, Catching the Deliberative Wave. So it has 289 examples of things like citizens' assemblies, citizens' juries from all levels of government. And what we've seen in this data is that this deliberative wave has been gaining momentum over time, and we're really past the stage of experimentation at this stage. In a sense, we have a pretty good idea of what works. So our report and our work also includes 11 good practice principles that can help policymakers at all levels of government. And I would say that in terms of maturity, what we're seeing right now is a move from just having projects to permanence. So public authorities institutionalizing citizen deliberation so that it becomes a normal part of the way certain types of public decisions are taken. So of course, it's not an approach for everything, but we are seeing that for many different types of policy areas, having more deliberative engagement is something that can really help governments. And while many are not there yet, I would say that's certainly the direction of movement that we're seeing in many EU countries today.
Thank you, Claudia. Indeed, I noted down the move towards from projects to permanent, and speaking about a very successful project that has now become almost permanent, I'd like to introduce Mr. Sandor Lederer next, who is working on the civil society organization K-Monitor on anti-fraud in Hungary. And some of the audience might know that yesterday we celebrated the International Anti-Corruption Day. And as Sandor is one of the front runners of demonstrating how civil society organizations can work to make public administrations more accountable in managing their funds, I'd like to ask him to convey to us what approach your organization follows and how we could replicate or copy this method and apply it to programs funded under cohesion policy.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks so much for having me. I'd like to share, first of all, that we in our civil society work even benefit a lot in working with our constituencies, meaning citizens in many ways. Just telling you a recent example where we were working on how to reform a part of the healthcare system involving petty corruption. We managed to do an interactive survey site and this was focusing on maternity care among childbearing women and young mothers, and 11,000 people filled out this interactive survey. So we received invaluable experiences and knowledge about, how those people who are really affected by policy measures think about these issues, what problems they have. Another issue where we are rather promoting participation was a campaign we did last year in Hungary to encourage local governments to commit themselves for transparency measures. In connection with that, several municipalities started to introduce participatory budgeting or do citizen assemblies, all methods that are quite new for Hungary. And finally, we also had the opportunity to work together with the Commission and create a discussion paper about this topic. And I was really pleased to see how committed colleagues at the Commission are when it comes to this issue. So I think there's a wide range of opportunities and ways how even civil society can have an impact in achieving a higher quality and a wider outreach in citizen participation.
Thank you, Sandor. I was actually captivated by your example of using citizens' knowledge in order to fight petty corruption in the healthcare. And you're actually showing also an example of a partnership, how civil society can help to bring together the knowledge of citizens and then help to improve the procedures and the working of public administrations. And I hope that we can really scale up these approaches across cohesion policy. And as such, I want to hand over and introduce now Francesco Amodeo, who is our cohesion policy expert at DG REGIO. And he is coordinating the citizen engagement pilot with managing authorities. Francesco, welcome. Could you help us clarify what the legal basis is to enable the participation of civil society stakeholders and citizens in the management of cohesion policy programs?
Good morning, Ramses. Good morning, everybody. It was very nice to be here with you and with colleagues from DG REGIO and discussing the topics of citizen engagement. When we talk about participation, participation is a concept, a principle which is part of cohesion policy since the really beginning. When we look at the regulation of the funds in the period 94-99, the regulation was already talking about partnership, and what we say was important to strengthen the involvement of economic and social partners. So civil society citizens were not mentioned, but it was say involve economic and social partners in programming in appropriate fashion. In the period 2000-2006, the regulation was broader because when we are talking about partnership at national, regional, and local level, member state shall, so there is a really strong invitation to create a wide and effective association with all relevant bodies. So there is not yet a reference to civil society, but the concept of partnership is getting broader. In 2007-2013, when they talk in the regulation about partnership, it also said that this partnership should also have any appropriate body representing civil society. So the first time in 2007-2013, there is a clear reference to civil society. And then when we come to the current programming period, 2014-2020, we have a regulation, a code of conduct which sets the principle for involving partners in the programming and in the delivery of the program. And there are very detailed explanation of what is the representatives, how to identify partner, about information, about consultation, and also about capacity building. So that's the way the concept of partnership evolved in 30 years of cohesion policy, how civil society get into the picture.
Thank you very much, Francesco, for giving us a brief and excellent overview of 30 years of widening of the legal basis for citizens' participation in cohesion policy. And I see that these advancements are very much linked to the different cohesion policy cycles. And as you know, we are in the process of preparing the new cycle for the years 2021 to 27. And the DG REGIO, we are promoting managing authorities to go even further beyond what's legally required. And of course, in the process of incorporating a new approach towards a meaningful citizen engagement through the partnership principle, there are certainly challenges that are being encountered by cohesion policy stakeholders. And we would like to discuss some of these challenges today and to present strategies and tools on how these challenges can be best addressed. And I would like to start with Claudia and then continue with Sandor and then conclude with Francesco on the following question. So Claudia, how can we integrate citizen participation in the logic of operational programs? And I will directly also mention the follow-up question to Sandor. How can we match the activities and the timeline at each stage of the programming cycle? So from the programming, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation with the right participatory level and the right participatory tools. And to conclude, Francesco, I'd like you to highlight how to avoid one of the usual risks, which is fragmented participation, meaning that certain activity where citizens are engaged is not continued and then runs down and it does not lead to a coherent strategy for citizen participation. So which approach can we apply to create this coherent in the way we engage citizens throughout a 7-year program? Claudia, let's start with you.
Great, thanks, Ramses. I think that's a really important question, and it's been on my mind a lot with this pilot project that we've been working on with DG REGIO, with you and Francesco, about how to integrate citizen participation in the logic of operational programs. So thinking about the objectives and processes and so on. And I mean, I think it is more difficult than just changing some of the rules about the processes or having certain objectives of citizen participation. Like, of course, we need those, but beyond that, it really does require a mindset shift within the managing authorities that citizens can help them in a more meaningful way than just via traditional consultations, which they're quite used to doing. And to be able to do this, it also requires some capacity building as a starting point, because most, if not all, of the managing authorities are very much used to engaging with stakeholders, and they're very much used to doing consultations. And engaging with citizens requires quite a different logic and a different approach. So it requires a new set of skills, and engagement goes beyond consultation. So, you know, there shouldn't be an assumption that all the managing authorities know this distinction, know what that means to be going a next step. And beyond that, I think something that needs to be considered in terms of the logic of these operational programs is that citizen participation, as opposed to just having stakeholder engagement, really requires political buy-in. It's not something that the managing authorities can just do on their own, launch citizen engagement processes without doing the necessary groundwork beforehand to get the relevant political actors on board to take the citizens' input seriously. So this is something that requires time, and I think needs to be factored into the logic of these programs in some way as well. And I think it also does require resources. Citizen participation is not something that can just be added on and be done by one person who might usually be in charge of communications. If we want to be inclusive in making sure we're hearing from a diversity of citizens of different backgrounds with different perspectives, that really requires a conscious design. It includes being able to pay participants for their time, to cover any transport or childcare or other costs that would barriers to participation. If we're doing things online, it requires thinking about technical support, having people in roles such as digital mediators. You know, how do you get those people who might have poor internet connections? What are you doing additionally to help them to make sure you're not only reaching those people who are well connected, etc. So I think these are all considerations which are very important, and which managing authorities which are used to dealing with stakeholders have not necessarily have the resources already dedicated for all of those additional efforts. So I think I'll leave it there by kind of summarizing that I really think that the logic of these programs need to include all of these considerations alongside just having the objectives and the recommendations of processes to follow in place. And I mean, we can discuss this further as the conversation goes along.
Thank you, Claudia. Indeed, I think you've illustrated how the mind shift needs to be accompanied by the right capacity building, because this is certainly not an easy task. And it's not only about regulation, but also about how to implement it in already quite a complicated framework that is structured by cohesion policy programs. So maybe I'd like to hear now from Sandor how we can address the issue of which level of participation to apply at which stage, and how managing authorities can maybe understand how to approach this new issue from the beginning in a way that is meaningful both for them, but also for civil society, and can really provide this added value that we're trying to capture.
Yeah, and I'd also really echo what Claudia has said about, you know, the need of commitment until those people who work in these programs and the design of the programming don't feel that they have a political backing, and the need of participation is really important. They really have a tough job to implement these principles. While I would say it's a necessity to bring this culture of openness through the whole institutional framework that is needed, because the programming cycle, to be frank, does not only start when it officially starts, but, you know, even in the previous programming cycle, meaning that you need to gather an immense amount of knowledge from all spheres of implementation, evaluation that can be fed in. So if in the process you don't have openness, communication, consultations, there is not really the information there that can be then fueled into the process. And coming to the sense of your question, Ramses, authorities really need to, I think, understand the levels of involvement and that is needed in programming, and it must be probably very different for, you know, different stages. And I would say, you know, the basic thing is simply informing citizens about, you know, the opportunity to engage about the topics where certain changes expected, or where cohesion policy might influence their lives. It's about consulting people in issues where really you need the contribution of them. Let's say where you design a bigger transition of a field, and it will impact people's lives for decades. You really want to hear how people feel about it, and, you know, it really will benefit also, I think, the program, in a sense that you can avoid a lot of conflicts. You can have a strong backing from citizens for the policies if, you know, these consultations happen when they need to happen, and in a form they have to happen, meaning also that probably you completely engage, let's say, an industrial group in a different way in a classic board meeting than, let's say, a broader constituency where you would organize a town hall, or you would do a citizen assembly or an online consultation. And finally, if there's really policy where you want to have hands-on work with the stakeholders, you engage them and you do co-creation. These can be workshops where, you know, a program, a part of a program is co-designed by the stakeholders that should be at the table. And again, I always mention these stakeholders, but what you constantly have to do is identifying those people and those groups that should have a say and that should be concerned. And this is not only something that concerns, and this is why, you know, you have to repeat these things over the whole programming cycle. So you don't only do it at the programming stage, but you also do it during implementation and also monitoring and evaluation, because, you know, the interest of the stakeholders can, and also the competencies can change over time.
Thank you, Sandor. I've noted down a nice quote that you mentioned, that the operational program actually starts before the actual program, because of course a lot of information, a lot of the work is carried over from the previous one, but also if we are trying to engage citizens for the first time, we need to provide them with this kind of background that is necessary in order to be effective. And you also noted down, or you also mentioned different ways in which citizens can add value, from not only providing their feedback on what they think is going to be useful for their region, but also in terms of providing necessary societal backing for maybe difficult decisions that need to be taken, that can also ultimately avoid the risk of getting into conflicts over some of these investments. And of course, certainly also the need for different methods to adapt to the different kinds of stakeholders that we are consulting. And I'd like to ask now Francesco maybe to get his perspective on how we can avoid the risk of participation becoming too fragmented if we have too many stakeholders with different priorities in mind. What are your thoughts?
Thank you, Ramses. I think when you have to choose what kind of approach to engage, to make participation with citizens meaningful, to remember, to keep in mind that what is the final purpose, what we want to achieve through this process. So the tools and the approach should fit the overall purpose of the exercise. In the context of a cohesion policy, we have to remind that this is about public policy. And in particular, cohesion policy is about public investment in the EU region, in all territory. And when we talk about public policy, we all know that there is not a single individual that can bring the solution. The solution of many mother and father. So it takes many actors to reach a solution. So public policy is multifaceted. So the first point, the first step that it's have to be considered before preparing the approach is to recognize that civil society and citizens, they do also are a role in participating. So the public investment policy maker, either the managing authority of the governance, they do need to recognize that CSOs, like other stakeholders, are part contributor to the solution. So before, when I was talking about the history of the partnership principle, this is what happened when at the beginning were the social part, but then also the civil society. And recognition sometimes of involvement from citizens many times happen through failure. I don't know, things about what happened, for example, when you want to prepare a classical waste management installation of some road infrastructure, or even a program for youth employment. So you failed, you recognize that your design, it doesn't suit the needs of the final user. What should I do? And then you recognize, okay, maybe I should have contact before. And this is the process of sometimes from failure, but sometimes also from positive history, like, I don't know, an awareness campaign, an information campaign that recognize that there is other actor can contribute. So I think the first step to design is really to the recognition of the needs. The second is experimentation. We need to experiment, to learning by doing. What is this, to really start to recognize the role of these other actors. And the history of cohesion policy, we do have many examples. Many of these examples comes from a local scale. I guess many of our participants today to the conference are aware of the community local-led development initiative, which are very small scale project, but also something which is more recent from this programming period, which are the urban innovative action, something that I was following closely in before. Indeed, you can see, for example, in the area of integration of migration, that many cities came out to viable, sustainable solution through the co-design with the civil society. So it's important to experiment, to learn, to develop, building a common interest, because the common interest describe what's the final purpose of this participation. Otherwise, the risk is to have a fragmented participation, as you were saying. So today, all member states are preparing the program to 2021-27. Many regions are involving stakeholders. This could take different form: debate, large debate, focus group, online survey. But the risk of fragmentation is not on the tool itself, but rather on the fact that the stakeholders don't really understand the context where this is taking place, what's their role, and how this what will impact. So as it happens for other stakeholders, what is necessary, something that we will discuss later on, is how to make CSO a new partner and potential partner for the future. So same time, same quantity of resources need to be invested to bring them on board, not for one-off event, but for a longer relationship.
Thank you, Francesco. And I'd like to actually build on the last comment that you made about how to really make civil society organizations a potential partner for the future. And in doing so, what are the first steps, let's say, that need to be overcome? Because certainly participation brings with itself certain inherent challenges. And I'd like to discuss those a little deeper. So perhaps, Claudia, how can we initiate a collaboration with civil society organizations, and how can we set up the trust with citizens when we're doing this for the first time as part of an OP? And then maybe Sandor, how can we actually avoid the risk of fake participation in case an authority might want to misuse or misinterpret citizens' interest against their own interest? And finally, Francesco, how can we reach beyond the usual stakeholders in mapping these for the engagement?
All right, so I shall kick off then with that. So again, that's a very good question about, about how do you actually gain the trust of citizens and civil society if this is really, the first time or something that's meant to be a significant shift. Because it's true that I think in some managing authorities, there has already been some legacy of engaging with at least civil society in some way. And I mean, I think it's about really trying to create the meaningful opportunities for citizen and civil society participation. So again, this is where it goes back to needing that mindset shift though, about what that actually means. It requires thinking, a few steps ahead of time, that like actually meaningful participation usually entails involvement at a much earlier stage in decision making. It requires the time to actually give citizens to understand the different options, to understand the context. So it means leaving them actually enough time for participation. It means designing things in a way that doesn't entail, putting up a huge PDF document and like having an email address saying you can email us your comments, because, that's not really engagement. It requires a completely whole set of, taking the time and effort to put in neutral language, and or not neutral, in simple language, what even is cohesion policy? What is this, like, why is this important to you as a citizen of this place? Like, what is, I think to many citizens, they don't have a notion of what cohesion policy is. But if you tell them that, there's this large amount of money coming from the EU to support our region for different reasons, that immediately, I think, sparks a different kind of reaction of people saying, oh, actually, this is quite important. There's a lot of money at stake, a lot of, projects that could be impacted in our region because of this. So I think that when it comes to the public communication about the opportunities for citizens and civil society, again, it requires a very different approach to traditional stakeholders who know a bit this language, who know a bit how the cohesion policy works, because it's already been, numerous cycles that they've had to be involved in different consultations and things. So reaching citizens and CSOs means, you have to adapt that language. You have to explain to people why this matters, why it's important. You have to, make them understand also why it's, worth their time to participate. People are all very busy with their families and friends and hobbies and other things, and to take the time out of their busy lives to really truly participate, they need to see how their inputs are going to be used. So that also needs to be really clear from the get-go. This is again why there is a need for the political buy-in. Like, there needs to be some sense that this is actually going to be taken seriously. How is this going to be responded to? How is it going to be implemented, etc. So like perhaps to make this sound like a little bit less abstract, I can mention one of the examples of the pilot projects we're working with. So for instance, in the region of Cantabria in Spain, we've been working with the regional ministry there, or the managing authority there, and they have done some of the groundwork to get some of the political buy-in from both of the regional ministries of environment and of finance, to be supportive, both in some sense financially, but also ready to be responding to citizens at the end of a few months deliberative process we're planning about how can the region move towards a low carbon economy. So here at the heart of it is a very kind of simply framed question, which resonates with the people in that area, that people can understand. It's a problem that's at the heart of it. It's not just feedback on some document. It's really like, as a region, we face this challenge. None of us are going to solve it on our own. There's many different possible ways forward. How can we work together to solve this challenge? And of course, citizens are at the heart of it, but they're also going to have a chance to hear from experts about low carbon economies, from economists, from other types of expertise, but they'll also have a chance to hear from all the relevant stakeholders. So it's not about removing the stakeholders from the picture either, but it's about giving them another role and having citizens and stakeholders working together as well. So this is a process that will take a few months, but at the end of it, citizens will have contributed really, really meaningfully to shaping some of the proposals that will be able to be funded through this cohesion policy program. So just to give a little bit of an idea of like how this requires a slightly different approach when you're really trying to get citizens at the table and giving them, giving up some of their time to really contribute in a meaningful way.
Thank you, Claudia. Let's go directly to Sandor and hear how fake participation can be also a risk, but also how civil society can play an active role in countering this.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, I would start with an example which you don't even can really categorize whether it was just, wrong participation, the lack of participation, or fake participation, because some of the parties involved claimed that there was participation. Is a bicycle road from Budapest to the Lake Balaton, which is a very popular holiday destination in Hungary. And you could not reach this part of the country from the capital city easily on a bike. It's around 100 kilometers, so it's a nice long way. You can also stop in between, so it's also good for local tourism. It's actually a project where you would assume it benefits really everyone. It has almost just positive, impact. Now, this project started, and of course, not everyone was asked, and itinerary of the road was designed by certain experts, and people who were, let's say, living in one of the small towns on the road figured out that before or in front of their houses a bike lane will appear, which will narrow down the pedestrian parts, which will, you know, take parking lots and so on. And there were huge protests, and the whole investment seems to be on hold now, simply because, you know, no one asked these people, or even if they tried to ask them, it was ineffective. And now you have a complete, you know, stop of this project and disappointment by many actors in a project which really could benefit everyone here. So this is just really to showcase how a really good and simple way and a topic which, you know, it's easy people to involve in, can even derail if you don't pay attention to all these things that were mentioned by you. And then coming to, you know, what you do in such cases, and also extremely when it's about fake participation, you know, as an NGO, sometimes you have to be, let's say, a bit radical. You can do even protests. You need to raise awareness among those people who are concerned. This can be demonstrations. This can be sometimes the blocking of the road. I mean, if you feel desperate in, you know, protecting your interests or the interests of your constituency, these are some measures that you might do. But there are, of course, much softer ways of approaching that. And I think the key element is reaching out to those stakeholders that are interested. And I have another example, which I think is very beautiful for this, was the building of a dam in the northern part of Budapest at the banks of the Danube, which is a very popular destination. And the dam would have completely, you know, they would have cut trees and completely reshaped this environment. And no one was again asked, I mean, citizens. So there were a lot of protests, there were collecting of signatures, and one civil society group started an alternative consultation. They started to ask people, what do you want to have here? How would you solve this problem? And they involved experts telling, you know, also the construction aspect of it, the hydrology aspect of the whole story, all kinds of environmental issues and financial issues, and they came up with real plans, alternatives for what, you know, the local government or the government wanted to implement there. And there was a real debate, and the local government had to back from its original plan, because they realized there is no social support for its purposes. So I think it's about really becoming active. It's about involving citizens. And if it's not the authorities who do it, civil society actors can do a lot for that.
Thank you, Sandor. I've noted down that for you, some of the value of civil society engagement is that they can provide an alternative consultation or an alternative plan to a proposed project. And I think this is really important in the context of cohesion investments, where so much money is poured into the regions, and oftentimes the consultations that are run by the managing authorities are standardized or do not reach, let's say, everyone or the right relevant stakeholders. And even perhaps, as you mentioned, perhaps they do reach them, but they do not incorporate the feedback that is actually said. And I think this is a very honest kind of discussion that we should be having within the managing authorities. And I'd like to hear from
Ramses. Let me add just one sentence, and I think this is also crucial. All these examples lead to an improvement. So you can clearly see that local governments, let's say, learn from this, you know, this miseries and these failures. And the next time you can already see that they start to prepare consultations, because they want to avoid these conflicts, and it's about their popularity as well.
Indeed. So this is really the learning by doing that Francesco was talking about later. Francesco, what is your thought on this? And also, how can managing authorities really learn how to capture the voice from those who might not have been heard until now? So those who need to be included in the table.
I think there are basically at least three elements to take into consideration. The first one is, like any market, there are barriers to entry. And the first barrier is about knowledge, because is a specific word. When we, particularly from the jargon, from the procedure, on the way it works, is really require an investment to understand how it works. So it's a policy which is 30 years old, so it's quite sophisticated. So if you are not used to that, you need to invest time and resources to make to open it up, in order that there is not this problem of understanding what is about. And so I think the first point is about openness, needs to be open. And on this sense, I think digital is very useful. The use of open data and the fact that many CSO use open data to communicate and to inform is opening up and allows civil society to participate and to contribute. We do as with our portal on our open cohesion, where we probably publish all the data on the program. We run a story, and recently our colleague of the communication unit, they start a very interesting project called Cohesion, where they collect information on all projects, where citizens can see what's happening. And I think many CSO, they are doing locally similar activities. So openness is the first key points to be sure to have all stakeholders on board. The second point for me is something that Sandor was mentioned as well, because we have a public investment policy with a long cycle, 7 years. So imagine in 21, the technocrats, as we say, come and ask you, okay, give me what are your priority for this, for the next 7 years. It could be that at that time, there are not a specific interest to participate, because there is a different cycle on their thinking, on the way of developing the proposal. So there might not be much at the time. And this can be an issue. So a CSO or citizen can be interested on greening our economy or reducing the impact of on climate change. But at the moment that we want to plan REACT-EU, Just Transition Fund, RRF, and cohesion policy, they are running on other business. And to avoid this, it's important to have, as we said before, continuity in the relationship. So if we cannot start a relationship with civil society at the moment of the programming, we can start during the implementation, or to see how projects are implemented. Or we can also invite them, as was also mentioned before, during the evaluation. So giving continuity in this relationship allow to reduce at least the risk to take out important stakeholders that we would like to be part of it. And the final element I think we have to take into consideration is to look on the other side, meaning not whether we are missing some stakeholder, but whether we are at the appropriate level to discuss that stakeholder. Because cohesion policy is a position where in our DNA decisions should be taken closer to the citizen. So sometimes discussing issues should not be EU level or national level, but a local level. If we take, for example, strategy for energy efficiency, it makes sense that this will be discussed at national level, and CSO and all industry participate at that level. But if we are talking about how to implement in my city, how to organize the street lighting, that's the level is not anymore the authorities in charge of the regional policy, but it should be the intermediary body or the beneficiaries working at local level. So that's, for me, is 3 elements that should reduce the risk that we are forgetting to include some stakeholders. So be open, avoid the barrier, look for continued relations, and be sure that we are taking the decision to the closer appropriate level, closer to the citizen.
Thank you, Francesco. And I am taking with me the idea of openness, the idea of continuity in the relationship with civil society, and also that we need to take these decisions at the right level, and the principle of subsidiarity is key in this. And I would like to link this also with some of the issues that Claudia mentioned about using citizen participation to solve the transition into the low carbon economy and the difficult, let's say, task that this will require, and the political support that needs to be there for, let's say, these opinions that are coming from the bottom, and that might sometimes clash, let's say, with the opinions from more established stakeholders. And I would like to link this with one of the questions that we have from the audience, from Paul Vittles, who is talking about the need to reach structural and cultural change. How much control do you want of the process? And to what extent are you prepared to let go of your desire to control the process? So this is an open question. And I want to first give the floor to our colleague, Patrick Lavelle, who is actually working on a youth engagement project in the Just Transition Fund. So I think this is really nicely fitting, in the sense that oftentimes youth have a very different perspective on how active we should be with regards to climate action and with regards to the transition into the low carbon economy. And so welcome, Patrick. And I would like to briefly introduce his project called Youth for a Just Transition, which is sponsored by DG REGIO and set up by 4 junior professional colleagues to maximize the participation of youth in the preparation, implementation, and monitoring and evaluation of the JTF in its targeted territories. And you've been working for quite some time on a toolkit for JTF authorities on how to do youth engagement. And you've already studied lots of practices that you've compiled with 30 best practices from across the union that are available on the Youth Transition platform. So I'd like to ask you, what are the main challenges when it comes to doing youth engagement, and how can we use youth engagement to answer also the question of Paul Vittles on the control that we want, that managing authorities need to give to citizens and to civil society. So what's your lessons learned from the projects that you've been analyzing so far across the union?
Well, thank you, Ramses, and thank you to the 3 panelists for what has been a fascinating discussion so far. And I actually think a lot of very relevant and complementary points have been raised that apply equally to specifically to youth engagement. So looking primarily, my lens of looking at this has been through cohesion and specifically imagine the just transition process. But I think there's a number of relevant points to come across. I think first of all is actually Francesco mentioned one of the most important first steps is having a clear objective. And that's a recurring point we've come across is a lot of youth stakeholders raise the issue of being engaged in processes which don't have a clear objective in the mind of the person hosting it. And so really, I think all 3 panelists have touched absolutely on the need for groundwork and to really have a clear objective in mind before you begin embarking this process. And I think arguably youth engagement is where you really see the highest levels of tokenistic practices. So certain people treating youth engagement as a box to tick or as something to embellish your project or just say you engaged youth. And typical examples of what I mean by tokenistic engagement might be, for instance, holding a youth event while ministers are meeting next door, but never actually, those 2 groups never intermingling with each other. So it's a press op, or maybe a speech in which somebody comes to make a speech and then leaves immediately. And so there's no engagement with the material or the ideas of young people. And so there are just some of the tokenistic practices. And I actually like Francesco's economic references to barriers to entry. And I often also, I think the issue of knowledge is equally important, and I often use the concept of a level playing field here. Unless you ensure you have the necessary supports in place to raise everyone's knowledge up to a certain level, even if you hold an engagement process and successfully reach different groups, certain groups will still dominate, those with the most knowledge. So you really need to equip everyone with the necessary understanding, using the necessary language to create that level playing field for successful engagement. And I think beyond this also, I think an important dimension to raise is reaching beyond usual stakeholders. In the youth engagement field, what we see often is that youth engagement tends to be dominated by affluent or more educated or more confident young people. And so we have certain groups of young people who are often not heard in these systems, be that those who've left education early, those in vocational education, also groups like children in care, young people with disabilities, etc. And also I think in the transition fund context, where a lot of it's focused on economic reimagination of these older industries, there's a danger of a gender dimension that, given there's so much focus in industries dominated primarily by men, we overlook the secondary impacts on women or the supporting industries around those which are equally affected. And so it's really important in policy supporting reimagination of the future of our economies that we don't re-entrench the existing inequalities and how we approach those, or inequalities of access of voices. And I guess one final point I would add actually is on, I really welcome Francesco mentioning the different stages. And I think this is really important when you approach, I think for a just transition perspective, we tried to look at 4 stages. So programming, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation, and really looking at opportunities in each, because involving young people in policy, as Claudia mentioned, has to go beyond consultation. It has to be something that follows the whole cycle of a policy and of a program. And so really imagining, looking at each stage of something and imagining, okay, how can we do participation here is a good, I think, advisable approach in that regard. And I guess a final aspect to choose from my many notes, because I think there's been a lot of fantastic material from all the colleagues so far, is the importance, I think, of building trust. And it links back to my first point I raised of tokenism. Often we can come from a place of distrust with certain groups. And so citizen engagement needs to try, I think, as Francesco mentioned, we need to clearly explain what we're doing and what the role citizens are offering. And I think that perhaps helps to address the question. Citizens need to have a clear idea of what exactly they're being asked to do and how much potential is available in this opportunity. And then also to follow that up with credible roadmaps and follow-up, so people can see what they contributed, what ended up happening to that. And digitization actually offers great potential here to bundle inputs and whatnot. And so I think I'll leave my comments there, but yeah, I think, as I've mentioned, I think a lot of what the colleagues raised so far is absolutely relevant to the youth engagement sphere. And in turn, I'd flag that I think youth really, particularly in the Just Transition Fund cohesion context, as the futures of these regions, they really have an important role to play. And it's important that that engagement is meaningful, that they're given the tools and they're empowered to come up with ideas themselves, and not just seen as a body to be consulted in a vague sense. But I'll hand back over to you, but thank you for the invitation to add these comments.
Thank you, Patrick. And I really look forward to seeing your toolkit on youth engagement for JTF authorities being published in January. And I hope that it captures some of the thoughts that you've expressed here, particularly on the importance of creating a real engagement between the decision makers and the youth, not only in parallel rooms or leaving just after their speech, but also to really engage, and oftentimes to engage in dissenting interests or in dissenting voices. So what happens when the opinions that are put on the table during a deliberative process are actually not the same or actually contradictive? So how can we deal with conflict, let's say, in participatory processes, and how much are really managing authorities willing to let go or to give to the citizens in order to take the decisions? Perhaps some of the other panelists want to react on this question from the audience. If you do, please just step in. Yeah, Claudia.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good question, and it links to a lot of what Patrick was just saying, which I very much agree with in many ways. That, I mean, I think that there needs to be a genuine openness from the public authority to actually be considering what they're asking of citizens to be coming up with. So it only makes sense to be doing any form of citizen or civil society engagement if there are actually different options on the table, that there's an openness to consider them. Otherwise, if that's not the case, which sometimes it's not, and that's also fine, then it doesn't make sense to do any like a form of citizen or civil society engagement. So I think we also need to be kind of limiting it to when it's genuine and genuinely possible and genuinely useful. And I think that's why it needs to be coming down to like when there's actually like a task or a purpose at the heart of it. So if, for instance, in the example that I mentioned, you know, that the problem that's uniting the citizens, the stakeholders, civil society, is about how can we transition to a low carbon economy. This is something that affects everybody, affects everyone in the community. It requires people not just thinking from their own personal perspective, but, you know, coming together, putting themselves also in other people's shoes, trying to find some common ground between them, and working together to come up with some recommendations and solutions. And because this is a sort of issue which is salient and prominent, but where there haven't already been a defined set of actions, there's actually numerous possibilities that are on the table. So it's a good example, I think, of when it really is going to, you know, make a difference, because these ministries are open to considering the different options that come up from citizens after they've had the time to learn. Going back to what was said about knowledge, you know, they're not just giving their opinions, because at one point, Ramses, you mentioned something about, you know, these opinions from the citizens going up, but actually they're not just opinions. These are much more informed and collective recommendations, which is a really important distinction to be making here. You know, people will have had the time to consider the inputs from different experts, consider the expertise, consider inputs from stakeholders, and then discuss with one another, bringing in the diversity of their perspectives, putting together collective recommendations, not individual ones from each member of this citizens panel. So yeah, those are a couple points that I would make on that question.
Sandor.
Can I add a thought, and it's partly also an answer to another question that came up regarding conflicting interests. And I think one very important element is, you know, having a highest level of transparency in these processes, to be entirely clear from the start what's the purpose of the engagement. Why are we doing this? What's the best possible outcome that we can reach? What's our particular interest as a certain group? And then also to provide feedback. So in case, you know, you cannot accept the recommendation, or you cannot, you know, there's never a project where you in 100% are able to fulfill everyone's needs and interests, but you need to explain, you know, why you did not take something into consideration. And this, I think, also contributes to trust. You are much more willing to give up on certain of your interests if you understand that you do it for the common good, or that it makes sense. And not if, you know, you just feel that because of certain power relation, your interest is not taken into consideration, or, you know, it's pushed aside and not talked about because it's easier not to do so. So I think this approach of being really transparent and really communicative in a sense of, you know, what's our interest, what's your interest, why do we take certain decisions, that's a key aspect. And you will never be able to, you know, avoid conflicts, but conflicts are not a problem if, you know, they're solved in a good way. They can contribute to even better outcomes, because at these clashes of interest, you actually find a way forward. So I think you can really solve these conflicts, and you can benefit from certain conflicts if you do it in a transparent way.
Francesco, yes.
Yes, I fully agree with Sandor and Claudia said, and Patrick, about the level playing field and the transparency. And indeed, the conflict of interest is not the issue in itself, in the sense that for me, we already have the situation where we have actors which at the same time are both on both sides, as a policymaker and beneficiary of the structural funds. So how many times we have a call for project proposal that the managing authority prepare with the final beneficiaries. and then have to assess the same actor as a potential beneficiary. The same way as we were discussing one of the pilot project, the idea is to have a co-design of support and assistance participation by the CSO. Also invite them to co-design the call. Doesn't mean that there is not a call of interest, a call of conflict of interest. The fact that the same actors are participating in the design and then are also the possibility to participate.
Thank you, Francesco, and thank you to Claudia and Sandor for your great answers. Indeed, I noted down the importance of also explaining why you didn't take a decision that was, let's say, proposed by a citizen collective, but also the potential that the decisions or the feedback from citizens goes beyond just a value opinion, but actually becomes an informed and collective recommendation that is built on solid ground. And I think that really links in with my final question to all of you regarding the enabling conditions that are necessary for effective civil society participation. And so this ties in with the topic a little bit of capacity building of the human resources, the intellectual resources, the institutional awareness that is necessary to bring in citizens on the stage. And I'd like to each of you give the opportunity to highlight a particular challenge or a particular strategy of how we can address capacity building in the context of cohesion policy for citizen engagement, both for managing authorities who might be unfamiliar with this topic, but also for civil society actors and citizens who might be also unfamiliar with cohesion policy. Claudia?
Yeah, sure. That's a good question. And we are doing capacity building with the managing authorities that are part of this pilot project as well. And I mean, it comes in the form of many ways. I mean, I think also all of our just initial conversations with them have been one part of the capacity building, but we're also doing more formal trainings for people who are working within the managing authority, but that are also extended to people who are part of monitoring committees or strategy boards, depending on, there's different processes in place. Strategy boards to civil society that can be part of these. And, these are workshops that we're doing, which will be longer. So at least one full day, which might be broken up, sometimes 2 days, and really starting with an element of learning. So taking the time to explain a bit the distinctions between stakeholder engagement and civil society and citizen engagement, because it's not the same thing. So what are the differences between them? What kind of different logics and approaches are needed? What kind of other skills are needed? How does public communication around what you're doing differ, etc. So there's an element of learning, bringing in some concrete examples from a few different countries to illustrate that there's also not just one approach to doing it. So giving an overview of the different methods of citizen participation, which are linked again to different purposes, because that is always the starting point, the purpose of what you're trying to do. And then there's a whole host of different methodologies that could help depending on the purpose. And then afterwards, I think capacity building works best when it's learning by doing. So we're taking, their context, their situation, and getting them to work also in small groups, and then coming back as a bigger group to go through the different elements of how you would design citizen participation linked to that purpose you have in mind. So starting with the purpose, the different questions you ask yourself, then starting with the purpose, but I did defining that as the problem and the task, what are you actually asking from the citizens? Then moving towards, the recruitment. How are you going to get people to participate? What are the different elements that you needed? How many people are you aiming to involve? How important is diversity to you? How are you going to make sure you achieve that diversity, etc. So really putting it in the form of different questions that these managing authorities need to consider for that stage. Then, you know, thinking about what we were talking about, knowledge, that requires some element of learning. So, you know, how are you going to design that stage? How are you going to make sure that, you know, you're going to create the conditions for citizens and civil society to have a level playing field and to be able to give some more informed inputs that will actually be more useful to you as that managing authority. And then, you know, going through the other elements. So depending on what kind of process it is, if it's more deliberative or more participatory in nature, there's a different set of questions and considerations that are then asked in terms of, you know, what size of the group is needed, you know, to what extent are discussions going to be facilitated, you know, is this happening in person, online, etc. So there's different like methodological questions that need to be considered, which again, have different sets of considerations than just stakeholder engagement usually does. And then finally about the communicate, well, no, the second last thing is about the communication and the commitment. So I already alluded to this as well, like how is this going to be publicly communicated, both before it happens and then afterwards? So like what is going to be the feedback loop? Who exactly is in charge of responding? Like actually identifying who that is, because that's also something that is not always considered. You know, the different channels of communication that will be used, what kind of delay are we going to agree to in terms of when citizens give us their inputs and when will we respond to them, you know, having all of this decided up front, and then finally having some notion of monitoring and evaluating what's been done, because I think the idea is if this is something that is going to become a recurring part of you know, of how cohesion policy and like the programming periods or other elements of this whole program cycle are done, then there needs to be some sense of like learning from, okay, we did this, what worked well, what didn't work well, and we should do differently next time. So getting them also to think about that from the beginning. So to me, capacity building, I think, works best when you're taking them through that whole cycle of thinking about all these different elements, but through the lens of like their context and the specific problem that they have at hand, so that it's not just abstract, but they're thinking about it through that way. So those are a few ideas.
Thank you, Claudia. Indeed, I really like the idea of like teaching them how to go through the different processes and from the methodologies that are needed, about the knowledge that is needed, how to set up effective communication and commitment, and not least important, also the importance of understanding what the value or what the results of a participatory process has been in terms of monitoring and self-improvement for the next process in the stage. Sandor, would you like to briefly highlight capacity building for civil society organizations? And maybe we could link it in with a question from the Q&A where an attendee is asking about the difference between citizen engagement and civil society engagement. So if you could briefly relate to that before we hand then to Francesco.
Yeah, I would say, and I think that's an important question. When you talk about civil society engagement, in my view, that's a more organized way of doing it. It's mostly established civil society organizations or groups that regularly work together, have a policy aim, have a structured way of working, have, you know, institutionalized knowledge, and so on. And citizen engagement can be, and, you know, for the previous one, an example is, let's say, the bicycle club, people who, you know, like biking and do advocacy around it when needed and so on. And citizen engagement is about really the individual. It's about the pedestrian on its own, the cyclist on its own, who has a view, who has an interest, who is living next door and simply, you know, feels that, you know, I have to say something, or I'm impacted and I'm concerned. So I think it's mainly this difference that I would highlight. And jumping from this point to, you know, the aspects of capacity building, I think most of the important things were said by Claudia. I would maybe add, especially when it comes to citizens, you know, people are working, they have little time, and you need to enable them to dedicate the time and let's say, the possibilities to participate. And you need to do it in a different way with the pensioner who has time during the day, with the young mom who is with the child all day, let's say, or someone who works in a factory and is only available on the weekends or the end of the day. And then two other things I would also raise. It's also capacity building in a softer sense, understanding each other's language, bringing together those stakeholders who work in a very different environment. Let's say even for us, when we talk with our colleagues at the Commission, the way how they deal with issues, how they communicate is very different than civil society. And sometimes you have here conflicts or you feel that's strange, but it's not about the lack of goodwill or somebody doing it in the wrong way. It's just a very different culture that needs to be connected and bring together to establish this trust. And then a final remark on that. All this has to be done in a sustainable way. You cannot build capacities if, for a certain project or one consultation, because it gets lost. You need to build this institutional knowledge at organization, and you need to make sure that, you're building up something for the long run. And I think this is very often missing, especially when it comes to the funding of, let's say, civil society, that you only stick to a certain project and have no idea what happens afterwards, and are maybe even disappointed when, it becomes unsustainable or it gets lost afterwards.
Thank you, Sandor. Before we hand to Francesco, I'd like to ask the audience, in case you have any last questions, this is your chance to post them. And now, Francesco, over to you. Thank you.
Yes, when we think from the perspective of the authorities, I think that citizen participation is just another component of good governance, nothing more. So in the way when you have a new tax, a new role, you need to prepare well yourself. And the things to do is things that emerge during the discussion. It's in terms of HR resource, internal organization of the people which have to do with this, that they have the competence and the resources to do that. Is the institutional preparation, how much this is integrated in the core business of the authorities. So does it remain separate as a information campaign, or is part of the core business? So how is the institutional setting adapted in order to include this new dimension? And also the process, that's what we were talking before. So we talk a lot about simplification, transparency in our process. So if we want to have this dimension, of course, special attention should be taken to simplifying our jargon and make more transparency in the way we work, if we want really to interact with the citizen. On the internal dimension. On the external dimension, the authorities should create the condition that this could happen. So to allow the participation. And this is not simply provide some training or some conference about what cities and cohesion policy is about, because we are, the member states are paid through the technical assistance for training, for conference, but they can do much more for the active participation of civil society. One example, just to mention very briefly, is the Integrity Pact, where we have for the first time civic monitoring on projects funded by the EU. My last word on CITE is just to underline and a big support of the EU fund managers, meaning these 26,000 public officials around the Europe, which are managing the funds, which are the connection between the reality in the territory and the EU. Claudia, she knows now, talking with them, how much they are playing this catalyst role. And they have, as one of them recently told me, they are a really a trusted partner. And to become a trusted partner, what they have to do is basically three things. First, to be neutral. Second, to create exactly transparency model that to everybody is aware of what is happening. And last, and possibly the most important, to be proactive in order to really create the level playing field, in order to see where there are some weaknesses in certain stakeholders and bring them to the level so it can really participate to the discussion. And this is the role that the EU fund managers around Europe have to play.
Thank you, Francesco. And thank you also for putting, let's say, citizen participation in the broad picture of good governance. And that also indicates that capacity building goes beyond specific projects and is a long-term objective, let's say, that contributes to this wider objective. And you've also highlighted concrete tools that are available in the context of cohesion policy, for instance, in the use of technical assistance to go beyond just trainings, the use of integrity packs that are inbuilt in the cohesion policy programs, and also the requirements, let's say, for the role of managing authorities in being neutral, creating transparency, and particularly being proactive. With this, I'd like to introduce our rapporteur, who has been patiently listening for almost 90 minutes, Karolis Granickas, who leads open contracting partnerships programs in the EU and the Balkans. And I would like you to maybe highlight what your main takeaways from the debate have been, and also to answer one of our audience's last question about the clear distinction between citizen organizations and civil society organizations. And maybe since you also come from civil society organization, you can provide us with your view on this, as well as your learnings from today.
Great, Ramses. Thank you so much. I found this discussion very rich, to be honest with you. I thought that we touched as many things as possible within the 90 minutes. So and I made a couple of points, not to summarize the discussions because that would be very superficial. But the points that I found specifically and particularly outstanding, if you allow me. So first of all, it's clearly that we are talking about making an effort to explain stakeholder participation in a more strategic manner, right? So we see that engagement is perceived as project, a channel, engagement initiative, that's to build legitimacy, is something of a have to do, and that is understandable. Sometimes authorities feel under pressure to do that, right? But in the ideal world, when we talk about all those amazing benefits, you would expect authorities to actually get excited about it, right? And the question is, how do you do it? And we need to start deconstructing this conversation into understandable bits, starting with the question, why do we need it? What is it that we're trying to achieve? And a lot of speakers mentioned that today. Like, for example, do we really need to make sure that someone without the internet connection remotely participates in policy making? I don't know, probably not. Do we need to ensure they access the opportunity to do that? Absolutely, yes. So for example, Sandor's example with a bike lane and what he mentioned about using specific methods and specific steps, for me made perfect sense. At the same time, this might be a trap. We often look for methodologies, for methods, but I really loved how Claudia, instead of jumping to talking about legal or procedural changes in cohesion staging, spoke about the mindset shift, right? Because essentially we are changing the relationship between people and their governments. Remember what's happening in the last 20 years, the theory of business for government changing, right? With all these flat structures, we have to make sure that governments are receptive and they outsource intelligence and outsource expertise from external sources. Simply, they don't have these resources themselves. They have to make sure that they're open and they make the best decisions. So and when you change any relationship, be it between two people or two societies, so government and society, it's a two-way street. So one thing that I missed, although we touched about the capacity of CSOs, but one thing I missed is this responsibility of CSOs also, right? We put all the responsibility on the shoulders of the public sectors, but how about CSOs? I personally remember participating in cohesion policy planning exercise in this working group in my own country, And honestly, the first time I went there, I had nothing to say. It was just too difficult to engage. I did not have capacity to do that. So me speaking then would be really responsible as well, because I would be influencing very important, policy agenda items, right, without having sufficient knowledge. So capacity, but also responsibility is something that we should be speaking about more, I think. Now, speaking about the capacity from the EU perspective is super difficult, because of the so many different countries, different levels and everything. But, I've got a feeling that we have to start somewhere. We are starting somewhere, but, the focus should be, the saying is that there is a will, there is a way. So the question is, how do you generate the will first, right? Because we'll have more opportunities to find a way when there is a will. So focusing on the benefits, focusing on strategic whys, like Francesco mentioned, why do you start the project, in essence, I think it's really crucial. And not mentioned explicitly today, but I would not forget the power of individual initiative of people in institutions. From what I have seen in my own engagement efforts, is that it often starts with a single individual at an institution, with a single individual at the CSO organization, and building that relationship, right? So that is often the case that, of course, and I loved what Claudia said about the trends of institutionalization, that we are heading into that direction, but at early stages, it's really about relationships between somebody, 1, 2, 3 people at the institution, or 1, 2, 3 people at the CSO or organization. So I would not forget the individual initiative. I would encourage champions, I would encourage more individuals at institutions to actually start on their own. And last thing that I wanted to mention, Francesco mentioned that briefly, but one thing I want to emphasize is that while, yes, we should be strategic about, the methods and methodologies and levels and when and what and how, but we should also agree on what is the minimum, right? What should be an absolute, necessary. And I want to emphasize the point Francesco made about data and information, that the provision of information about cohesion policy or spending, it should be an absolute minimum. And I would also add the engagement channel as such, be it an online channel or whatever, but we should agree on what is the minimum. Now, speaking about, so that would be maybe a summary. Speaking about the question, I think it's let me just have a look at it. So the question is really about the example between the differences between. Can you please repeat that to me?
Thank you, Karolis. I actually think that in terms of time management, we sadly need to wrap up. But I would like to thank you very much for actually pointing out some of the items that were maybe not so much covered in the conversation, and that I hope can provide food for thought for the rest of the festival. And those are the responsibility of civil society organizations, and also, as you rightly said, that individual action can trigger the mind shift that needs to follow up in becoming, let's say, a mainstreamed across, let's say, EU policy, EU institutions, and managing authorities across the EU. And with this, I'd like to thank everyone who has been joining with us. And I would like to wish you more enriching events during the festival. And of course, to hope that this discussion may have triggered some thoughts and highlighted strategies and opportunities. And of course, how capacity building can help to overcome some of the challenges and gaps encountered along the way to promote citizen engagement and good governance in cohesion policy. So thank you, and please stay during the next events of the Citizen Engagement Festival. Thank you.
Thanks, Ramses. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.